The debate being discussed is a disagreement centered around the substituting of some words in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, mainly changing the N-word to slave and Injun to the more politically correct Indian. On one side, you have a group of people and scholars supporting the change. They believe that the language used in the text is deleterious and distracting to the minds of the young reader. The person who seems to most support this is a Yale graduate, Paul Butler. He says that people were too focused on the word and seemed to have endless discussions about its significance in the book. He said, "I suffered through Huck Finn in high school. The white kids going out of their way to say N-word Jim." Paul seemed to have to deal with the distractions the word provided some readers personally. James Dubbin, a professor of English, says that students should be able to read modified versions of the text at the teacher's discretion. On the other hand, you have a group of people who oppose the change. These people believe that for many reasons changing the text is wrong. One woman, a Francine Prose, makes a valid point asking the question, how is slave any less offensive? In her article, she discusses how while the N-word may indeed be offensive and powerful, the author put it there to make a statement. Prose argues that slave should be just as revolting to us in American society, considering how the book reveals us to a time period when white people were allowed to traffic others for money. Another author, Davis Matthews, suggests that the word Twain's chose are put there to put strain on the reader and to make them consider the life of Jim and others during that time. Both sides of the argument make valid points, though we as a group feel that changing the text was incorrect.
If the racial slurs were changed in the novel, would it change the way the reader visualized the text?
No, I don't think that it would really have much of a difference on the plot and the text. It might change certain scenarios in the story, but it wouldn't change the book as a whole.
Absolutely, because that's the way people actually spoke back then, so to not use that type of language I think would take away from the authenticity of the
Do you
novel.
agree or disagree with the use of racial slurs in Huck Finn?
I agree.
Yes, I do think the use of racial slurs is necessary and used well in Huck Finn.
Do you agree or disagree with the use of racial slurs in Huck Finn?
I agree. Yeah, I think so. Personally, I know that if I was in 6th or 7th grade and reading this story, I would be distracted by reading that word, and I probably would lose my focus in the story and go off topic.
Yes, because the racial themes need to be showcased.
The use of the N-word in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn greatly impacts young readers' comprehension of the story because it makes the racial implications of the novel very apparent to young readers, whereas if the N-word wasn't used, they might not realize the racial implications and struggles of that time period.
Jim was monstrous proud about it, and he got so he wouldn't hardly notice the other ends. Ends would come miles to hear Jim tell about it, and he was more looked up to than any N in that country. Strange Ends would stand with their mouths open and look him all over, same as if he was a wonder. Ends is always talking about witches in the dark by the kitchen fire. But whenever one was talking and letting on to know all about such things, Jim would happen in and say, what you know about witches, and that end was corked up and had to take a back seat. Jim always kept that 5-center piece round his neck with a string, and said it was a charm the devil give to him with his own hands, and told him he could cure anybody with it and fetch witches whenever he wanted to, just by saying something to it. But he never told what it was he said to it. Ends would come from all around there and give Jim anything they had, just for a sight of that 5-center piece. But they wouldn't touch it, because the devil had had his hands on it. Jim was most ruined for a servant, because he got stuck up on account of having seen the devil and been rode by witches. Here in this passage, we are introduced to Jim. Jim teaches us the difference between being well-educated and intelligent. Our early impressions of Jim are he doesn't seem very smart. However, we can conclude that Jim is in fact intelligent. People come and give him things to see a nickel he claims he got from witches. Doesn't that make him intelligent due to his trickery? Aside from the intelligent side, we see that the N-word is not meant to be used as an insult. The word in this passage is Twain's way of stating that Jim is black. It is not meant to degrade him in any way, shape, or form. Twain's language was used as if he were back in that time period as an observer listening to these conversations between the characters. He wanted his passage to be as realistic and engaging for the readers as possible. Changing the meaning of the word in this passage would make it even more insulting. For example, the sentence, "Slaves would come miles to hear Jim tell about it, and he was more looked up to than any slave in that country." Thinking about the word slave in this context would demoralize all blacks and create situations that were related to slavery, but not related to what Twain was saying whatsoever. Changing the word is basically classifying all blacks as slaves.
Using the N-word causes for much discussion in the classroom amongst teachers and students that allows the students to dive into the past and let that reality hit. The N-word and the word slave are not interchangeable. Slave was a word used to describe blacks who had no rights and were held captive by masters. However, Twain's use of the N-word was not used to imply that these blacks were legal property of white men. He chose his wording carefully and wanted his language to help readers connect with the characters as if they were back in that time. Using the N-word is a teaching tool. It may be uncomfortable for some to fully digest this word, but it is a part of history that students of all ages must be opened up to. Changing the N-word to slave would change the meaning of the text. Although it could be changed to slave to be less aggressive, it still does not allow readers to understand the full text. Those old enough to read the book are able to understand the demeaning word or how vulgar it truly is these days. That is motivation behind the learning movement. The N-word used by Twain is a way for students to understand the history behind the story and also the history behind the word itself and how it is still used in racist ways today.